really do think you're speaking our language. And last but not least, it's my great pleasure to introduce the late entrant to tonight's speaking event, the Honourable Professor Michael Buxton, who's come late from another speaking engagement, but it's wonderful that we can welcome him here. Professor Buxton teaches at the RMIT and has done since 1998. He's advised the government and advised policymakers on a number of issues, on a number of committees on these issues that we want to talk about here tonight, and many others. And he brings an academic clout and a degree of high class to this event tonight. Thank you, Mr. Buxton, for coming.
Thank you. Sorry I was here late and didn't hear the first speaker, but hopefully I can pick up the tenor. As you know, owners of high-rise apartments and body corporates face what has been called sometimes a sort of tidal wave and an unrecognised set of problems that really haven't been recognised fully up until now, of a scale that is unprecedented in Melbourne. We've heard quite a lot tonight about the uses of high-rise apartments and the problems that they're causing. We really have to remember that the high-rise residential boom in Melbourne really only started around about 2004, 2005 in earnest. There were high-rise buildings in Melbourne before this, and they tended to be of a higher quality construction, and many people moved in to those high-rise apartments and are very happy in them because they led the way. Many of you, no doubt, are in that situation and have found that circumstances have changed, as we've heard, by the majority of occupiers of apartments now are short stay users, young people, students and so on. RMIT, for example, is a huge supplier of personnel to Melbourne apartments from overseas, 20,000 overseas students, and it makes a major contribution to the economy of Melbourne. They live mainly in the central city, in apartments often shared, and this has led to the kind of problems we've heard about. High proportion of rental apartments in the new construction and very poor quality apartments on the whole. But there's another real sleeper issue here, and you know it very much so, and that's the problem of retrofitting faulty apartments. And this is just becoming known. I've just been trawling through some of the body corporate management firm material on this, and what some of the really large companies who manage body corporates and strata title arrangements for apartment holders, and what they're saying about what they call shoddy construction, and it's quite amazing the quality of a lot of the apartments and the problems that this is causing. One, for example, from one of the really big body corporate management firms is talking about 40% of Victorian property owners suffering financial loss due to building defects. And a recent engineers report, New South Wales apartments, with over 2/3 of them were defective upon completion. One of them had estimates of 4,000 kilometres of fire risk electric cabling being installed in apartments. I know personally people who run companies such as plumbing companies that used to be able to bid successfully for new apartment construction but are underbid now by plumbing firms that put in lower quality plumbing fittings, including piping that isn't going to last. And I know of whole apartment blocks now that these companies are renovating, retrofitting, and they're not 10 years old, at millions of dollars. Now these are time bombs waiting to happen, not in every apartment, but in large numbers of apartments. Electrical conduit, material, plumbing, we've heard all about the cladding issue, and this is going to be sheeted home because of the law to individual apartment owners and body corporates. They're going to have to find millions of dollars in, not in every apartment block, but in many apartment blocks in future years. So this is what has been called by these, and I'm just going through what the body corporate management firms themselves are saying. They're pointing to this time bomb. So this is a really major problem governments have got to get on top of. There's already a huge problem. We've heard about the scale of this problem here. There's about 146 high-rise towers approved in recent years are in the pipeline, and the figures we've taken out on City of Melbourne and inner urban suburbs, up to 350 high-rise and medium-rise towers approved in the last 2 years or in the pipeline over the next 3 and 4 years. We're talking here about traditionally about 12,000 apartments built in the inner areas of Melbourne a year, and that's recently gone up substantially. Some estimates up to 17,000. It'll probably come back a bit, but a lot of people are talking about a glut of high-rise apartments. But this is, we've heard a bit about the scale of this. Let's make no mistake about this. Melbourne is one of the 10 top cities for residential apartment construction in the world, outside China. Right? Now, and outside some of the big Asian cities. It's massive. We are in the big league of apartment construction and high-rise residential tower construction. And the problem with all this is that the governments have got a completely deregulated system of approvals through the capital city zone and through building mechanisms which simply, building regulations which do not do the job at all. They're lowest common denominator building standards. Governments have put these deregulated or relatively deregulated systems into place and sat back while year by year the problem has multiplied in scale, and they have done little or nothing about it. And all of a sudden governments are now looking at this problem and saying, well, we've got a real problem with the scale of high-rise, with its impacts, with its effects on city heritage, for example, on city amenities for overshadowing and wind and all those issues. But it's only relatively recently emerged that the problems in defective building and construction is posing a huge ongoing problem to apartment owners, or not all, many apartment owners and body corporates. So this is a sleeper issue that has come out because of the recent fire. The cost of retrofitting is enormous. Now, hopefully you won't be in that situation, but many people will, and it's a huge problem in getting agreement. A lot of the apartments, probably 40% of new apartments on individual apartments are owned by international or investors all up, many of them international investors. There's a very diverse lot of owners now, and as we know, a high rental rate. So these are major problems that are sleeper issues. Another real governance problem that is behind a lot of this is the private certification of the building system through building surveyors. I mean, this would never have happened. So we have a situation where building surveyors issue approvals for buildings which have non-complying materials or low quality standards in them, and in many of these cases they don't know the materials that they're approving look as if they're okay. They look identical. They don't have systems in place to be able to detect defective, fire-prone materials, for example. Building surveyors are often put in a very difficult position, but in these cases, often council simply will not even know about the problem. So governments issue a planning permit approval for any building over 25,000 square metres and just wash their hands of everything from then on until there's a fire or until the plumbing systems break down. This is a shocking indication of inadequate governance, where state government does one thing with no regard for down the track impacts. Councils don't know often what building surveyors are doing, and then they have to pick up the pieces, and they don't pick up the pieces because they're not legally responsible. So it's left to the building owners to take class actions, for example, very expensive class actions against the building surveyor or against another approval agency. Now this kind of inadequate governance has simply got to be fixed. So we've got a real problem in many ways here through inadequate construction, through the scale of the construction, through its impacts. And many individual apartment owners and collectively the owners of buildings are going to have to pick up the pieces, and it's going to be a real problem. Over the next 10 years we're going to see all sorts of difficult results emerge. So it is utterly critical that governments get on top of this. First of all, we just simply do not need to be building high-rise construction of this kind. It is not good. There's not one reason I can think of for it. You don't need high-rise to have high density. I just find it fascinating that many of our federal and Victorian politicians get on planes and go over to places like Paris and Barcelona for their holidays, which are some of the densest cities on earth with incredibly high amenity, and there's not a building hardly to be seen over 6 and 7 stories, unless you go to the fringe where the poor people live in high-rise tenements. So we know we don't need high-rise buildings. We're going to be developing Fisherman's Bend with massive, and Eagate, and in a big ring around Melbourne, and many of our big commercial new employment centres as high-rise towers. When we know we don't need that, we can have high amenity, high density in the way hundreds of cities have managed to achieve over the world to the benefit of everybody, including the tourism economy. So these are the kind of problems that really governments must get on top of, instead of trailing along through this system of deregulated governance, washing their hands of systems, and then individuals like yourselves are having to pick the pieces up. And that is not fair. It is not fair, and it really isn't a sustainable way to go, because it's only going to get worse unless something fundamental is done about it. The horse has bolted, a bit of some of your questions have raised. I think the horse has bolted, but it hasn't jumped the fence down the other end of the paddock yet. There is a bit of time to rein it back in before Melbourne becomes dysfunctional through a series of high-rise apartments, which I think in probably 30, 40 years are going to be unlivable, and many of them will be pulled down. We don't want to be building a city that isn't going to work and will have to be renovated and changed in 30 or 40 years, and I think there's a lot of evidence that's where we're going. So let's stop that, think back and figure out where to go from here.
Thank you very much, Professor Buxton. I'd now like to hand over to Mr. Rus Littleson to speak a little bit more about the We Live Here Association and to give you the spiel for the membership drive, which is the other part of tonight. Please welcome Mr. Rus Littleson.
Thank you, Tom. Well, thank you for the speakers for enlightening us in so many ways. And for pointing out that we are trying to build a community. Each one of you has made that point, and I think this is where we started with this campaign. As you know, the genesis was at Watergate with some particular problems that we had, but we started recognising that this is a general concern for all apartment dwellers, residents, owners across Melbourne, across Victoria, across Australia, and indeed globally. And we tried to make up a campaign that would appeal to everybody to get involved and start helping make some change. So we want to have a voice. We want to talk to politicians, and we want to make a difference. We want to make some change with the regulations and the legislation. We've had a litany of issues raised before us tonight that have to be addressed. And how are they going to be addressed? They're going to be addressed by us as owners and residents. And the idea behind We Live Here, I'm going to explain to you as is encapsulated in this logo very, very well. There's a number of points in there. First of all, we have the We Live Here in quote marks. That tells you that we are talking about a voice. The subtext of here in there, of course, is we live here and we vote. So being part of this and making a change, getting our voice heard by politicians on all sides of politics, and making some change. So that's part of what the voice is, why we have quote marks and why we're saying we live here. You can see the logo itself is made up of pin drops, and the pin drops come together to form a heart. Because what we're talking about here is community, and as a community we are the heart of Melbourne, we are the heart of the country. So we're people, we have a voice, we're going to make a difference, and that's the basis of this logo. We'd like to see everybody join this movement and be part of it and make a difference. So, and we'd like to see pin drops dropping all over our map of where people are joining. So, how are we going to do this? Well, it's a social media campaign to start with, and we have a website which I'm sure most of you are familiar with already, and we will be putting a lot more material on that in the coming weeks. Of course, we'll have Facebook and Instagram and Twitter accounts and forums like this tonight, and also, of course, direct lobbying of politicians. So that's the sort of spread of activities we're going to be involved in. And with the website, we'll be having requests for information because, as you saw before with the information about, say, 2 tonnes of laundry and all that sort of the hard data, we need to gather that data, and we've had a lot of experience at Watergate gathering that data, and we're going to share that experience of how you in your buildings can actually gather information from what you have, because we need to have empirical evidence, and I think the Honourable David Davis pointed that out, that it's based on fact. You have to have hard data. It's not an emotional argument, it's based on rational logic. This is a matter of statistics, it's a matter of economics. It's an economic question which has impact on community and social. So we need to gather that data, and we have a group of people around the country or around Melbourne who can access that information, so you in your building can access information about your building, your particular circumstance. So we'll be putting up surveys onto the website, and we'll be asking you to provide information in a form that can be aggregated. So with that, as we accrete that data, we will be able to draw conclusions and provide politicians with the ammunition they need to get their parties on side and make changes and make a difference. But we need to have the information, and we need to have the support, and all of that is in this room right here now. You are giving us the support. You have access to that data, and we need to get that information from you and just grow that level of data that we've already started developing through our own efforts at Watergate. A number of swipe issues, particularly if you have defects that are affecting you, we need to aggregate that information in a logical way that can be analysed. So whilst we have, you can have an open-ended discussion with a narrative and describe things, we need to break it down into numbers and data so that we can present it as hard facts to the politicians who can make a difference. So, but fundamentally it's about people, it's all about people, and we want individuals to join the campaign. So we'll be incorporating as an association, and we're looking for individual memberships, so anybody can join this group and be part of the campaign. We would also like you to go back to your owners' corporations and say, have the owners' corporation join as well, or make a contribution to the campaign fund, so that we can continue our activities, because all this costs money, and keeping websites and so forth, and the collateral we have to produce. So